is an important art form that continues to flourish. Among the most accomplished weavers in West Africa are the artists of the Ewe and Asante people of southern Ghana.
Okay, so this week's
Evidence shows that the art
lecture will center around
and continues
Jemima
to
Pierre's The Predicament of Blackness, Postcolonial Ghana and the Politics of Race,
large markets
specifically chapters 6 and 7.
Ghana cater to
We're going to start with chapter
bread,
6.
parts, and other materials. Young men and boys are apprenticed to master artists who train them as weavers and sell their work.
Which is titled, Are You a Black American? Race and the Politics of African Diaspora Interactions. So the author in this chapter begins the chapter with a story of them going on a trip to Ghana, Accra, specifically, where they begin to meet some politically minded folks and joins their First Fridays monthly meeting where they do community work. They ultimately end up at a conference. This is taking place in August of 2000, where they have books. It's a book reading. It's a book club, as well as some community organizing. And in doing so, she relates the interactions that she has during that time with a more general conversation with the realities and the projections of Pan-Africanism. For instance, and this comes up multiple times in this chapter, where she is told by some of her people around her that is she one of the lucky black people that made it to America due to her ancestors being chosen. She'll have statements that says, look how well you all are doing over there, or your ancestors were lucky enough to escape the poverty and hopelessness that we are now living in Africa. And so they're in this singular sort of dialogue, I think encapsulates the tension and the confusion around identity as it's understood from the opposite side and the opposite sides of the Atlantic. It begins with a quote from Iko Eshun with his book, Black Gold of the Sun. I looked at the guides in their basketball vests and Nike sneakers. America for them meant Kobe and Shaq and Michael Jordan. Across them stood the tourists. In their eyes, Africa was a land of enduring wisdoms. They were its lost kings and its Nubian princesses. Both groups saw in each other a reflection of their own dreams. Africa and America converged, each searching the other's eyes. I thought that was a really interesting quote to begin with, primarily where Ishun says they both saw in each other a reflection of their own dreams. And instead of a reflection, I was wondering if it was more of a projection of what information, between, I guess, the transatlantic slave trade all the way up to today, almost today, because I think with the introduction of internet and its access being much more broad as opposed to the 2000s and even the 2010s, that most of the communications that were given and spread and broadcasted throughout Africa and Ghana, which has its own political history, which we'll get into, connects with the CIA's sort of imposition of anti-communist thought that after Kwame Nkrumah, they began to sort of abide by. That there's just a confusion about what each other's political and cultural identities are, to the point to where, and this is understandable, and I can understand why he was seen this way, but W.E.B. Du Bois was understood to, have So to think about Africa through a colonialist lens, that was the critique that was given to him, and that's real. But I would also say that that works both ways. That Western imperialism has changed not just Guyanian identity and their own transnational black diasporic politics, but ours as well, and even how they think we see them. So it's a different kind of double consciousness. And in thinking about that, something that we spoke about last class around civilization or revolution or identity from below, or racialization from below, how is that even possible in modernity? How can you essentialize your understanding of yourself without acknowledging and understanding that the imposition of colonialism is sort of all over the place, considering that it happened? And so instead of thinking about it as racialization from below, we might be able to think about it as representation from afar. So this idea of racecraft, or the ontology or the becoming of race, has so much to do with what was communicated during the times that those who had the power and the long reach of media could address either civilization. And so there are some questions specifically that Jemima Pierre asks in this chapter, which I want to return back to and kind of hover around, and hopefully at the end of this we can double back and begin to answer some of these. Under what circumstances can a discussion of slavery create hostility? The idea in Ghana, even in academic circles, was that to continuously bring up slavery would not just destabilize the political order, but the cultural identification that Ghanaians have, that it is a diasporic obsession or preoccupation with slavery that Africa doesn't have. And we'll get into this in the second chapter, that tries to contend with this dichotomy of transnational blackness or diasporic blackness, and the potential intellectual or institutional gulf between that and continental African thought, that they presumably have different ideas, different objectives, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. The second question is, why do a black diaspora presence and a preoccupation with slavery present such powerful potential for political destabilization on the local level and transnationally? Again, I sort of hinted at this, but clearly, and we can get into, like I spoke to before, the sort of CIA intervention during right after the Red Scare that Ghana sort of co-opted because it was to their benefit. Culture does have the ability and the transmission of expressing if not true culture, then culture coming from the mouth of those that situate themselves in that culture, is really important. That true communication between these communities was sort of not possible. And then the last question is, why is not the same charge made, for example, on the presence of European and U.S. business interests, or of Ghana's contemporary marginalized position within the cultural and political hierarchies of Western hegemony? You hear me talking in circles. That last part coincides with histories that I'll get into, but also what I feel like is sort of hovering above both of these chapters is the framework of colonialism and neocolonialism, where, again, what we'll get into is that there is a tension between Black Americans and not just Africans, but in this particular situation, Ghanaians, where they're called Josephs. People from Ghana and Accra called this cohort that came from America Josephs, which was considered the favored brother that went on the ship, or the door of no return, went through the door of no return and began the transatlantic slave trade. That through that process, you were given the proximity and the resources to wealth, or all of the quote unquote goods that come with a closer proximity to whiteness. And for most of us listening that are born in America and reside within Western culture, that's a hard pill to swallow. But instead of negating it, which would lead to a further continuation in the cycle of that tension, we can really begin to understand that the state is selling this notion back to itself, which from last class we talked about how the state can co-opt certain radical actions towards its own means. I think this sort of hyper specificity of locale and the refusal of slavery's context that still circles Africa in general is sort of disallowed, and in doing so creates these conditions that is so prominent in chapter 6. Something she also talks about is she went to the Elmina Castle dungeon, which includes the door to no return, where there was a separate group from Washington, D.C. that, came across as very Afrocentric. I think this book was written in 2006, so I don't think she had the term Hotep available, but that was basically the idea. And when they went to the door of no return, which I spoke to of what it was earlier after the tour guide had spoken to, what happened here, they basically poured glass and did a brief ritual as a means of acknowledgement. And something that I thought was interesting that the tour guide said is that it's funny how Americans so quickly take ownership of this place, of this room in particular, which is a really small room. And he said he's seen this sort of thing before. And well, one, it already got a little nuanced because the quote unquote American group was led by a man from Ghana who had moved to Washington, D.C. and then continuously brings people who have either done the same or people who wanted to go to Africa to, make this connection, which in chapter 7 tries to interrupt that with trying to reach the idea of Africa as past a sort of pure or an authentic or an essential state of knowledge that anthropologists like Melville Herskovits and Robert Ferris Thompson really start to dig into, and then start to sell this idea of Africanisms and African retention, which, funnily enough, is a similar situation that happens in the Americas with New Orleans, that the idea that it might be considered a sort of source of African American thought has also led it to basically the museum treatment, that the idea is nothing new can happen here because so much has happened here, that it's a source and not a space of progression. And this has led to a number of, at least in Africa, this idea that I was providing the example in New Orleans, that it's led to a lot of African institutions to not be funded, or even African professors in HBCUs to not get any sort of funding for their own projects, because it's not understood through the means of diasporic research, that it's purely continental and it's just trying to replenish what was lost instead of what has been pretty much the modus operandi of the diaspora, which is to spread this more global understanding, or even a sense of a cultural nationalism, whether it's in the Caribbean that we see with Glissant, or with the Black is Beautiful campaign or Black Power that happened after the civil rights movement here in America, which then later became the Black radical tradition, which was started by Cedric Robinson and Jared Sexton, and has a number of offspring that came from that, like Fred Moten or Frank Wilderson III or Saidiya Hartman. So to go back to this idea of the ownership of the Americans, it makes me think about how extraction, and particularly Western imperial extraction, moves so beneath the conversation that happens between these two communities, that instead of just thinking about what was taken and the voids that are left in that place, and whether or not the people that left from that place now have a responsibility to come back with their wealth or their resources, that really both of these perspectives should be shifted towards the people in the cultures that took, and I'm saying took is the verb, like they did the taking, instead of thinking about the things or the people that were taken, and now that they're back, what they have to give back. Think about the people that really did the taking. So to return back to this question, under what circumstances can a discussion of slavery create so much hostility? I would say that thinking about the slave experience as having consequences bidirectionally from where those ships hit shore, as well as where they embarked from, can rid these ideas of purity with respect to diaspora. So if you have these people returning back to these, and this goes back to roots and routes, that these roots, what you return back to, is not in a stable place. It has shifted and it has changed and is still producing thought in structures that are integral to these transnational conversations, and should not be thought of as an inherent authority simply because of its locale. So I want to leave here, maybe you can pause it for a second and think about certain questions of how Western imperialism negates or potentially refuses the idea of racialization from below, where to think about it on a pure binary might be a fool's errand, but hey, maybe I'm wrong. Let me know what you think.
Revolution is getting the minorities to want to be the majorities, getting the poor to want to live better, getting the whole United States to live like Brazilians. Commercial life can make sometime a person forget to be a person. Sometime when competition brings you out of your humanitarian position. I also feel that people in Brazil have a lot more humanity toward one another. The black man in America is only trying to struggle to say, I am, I want to, and let me be.
Okay, and so with chapter 7 from same book, we have a much more theoretical conversation surrounding race and racecraft. So this is called Race Across the Atlantic and Back, Theorizing Africa in the Diaspora. And just like last time, I want to begin with the leading quote. Double disposition in consciousness and cognition, that fracture in black ontology produced by Western imperialism, is not the exclusive property of the diaspora branch of the Black Atlantic. It is to be seen both here in the old world and there in the new. And that was by Kwaku Larbi Korang. And I kind of want to start here really with the sort of linearity, which I think is the main disruptor in how African thought and really biological essentialism, where this Afrocentric thought is potentially just a reconstruction of Eurocentricity due to its linearity of what might be understood as the old world versus the new, that the introduction of linear time does a lot of damage to how we see ourselves as both residing in the world right now. That this, like I said before, the museumification of Africa does, it introduces a lot of confusion in the Black studies realm. Something that is also quoted in this chapter is Saidiya Hartman's idea of how do we construct a collective memory of the past. I feel like this could lead to a mutual understanding past the projection that I was talking about in the past chapter, and in doing so we can formulate a narrative that includes each other on the same side of this imagined diaspora, or honestly one that has no side. Again, trying to get away from this sort of Cartesian X and Y understanding. And like I said before, with slavery not being integral to how Guyanians see themselves, they're kind of taught to forget a history that they never learned, or to refuse a history when it's trying to be remembered by outside parties. And so through this heritage tourism, the onus then falls on the diaspora to include into this conversation something that was sort of societally taught to dismiss. And this is something that the U.S. and the CIA actually tried to deal with during the sort of 20th century spread of communism in the 50s. I want to talk about something that isn't in the chapter, but I think might be important. So this idea of the Joseph, or the long-lost Joseph, the favored brother, is one of these broadcasted racializations that have had no context or have come from the voice of the people that are being defined, i.e. Black Americans, to Ghana. For example, you have minstrelsy being brought to Ghana from Hollywood in the 1920s. As Hollywood continues to grow, you start to get black celebrities in the later portion of the 20th century with Denzel Washington or Halle Berry or people on TV and television like Oprah Winfrey. And the idea is that, similar to Shaq and Kobe, that this sense of well-being is singular, it's monolithic, and that is purely Western imperialism. And what that has led to is a perception of resentment and deference through tropes. That larger trope is
E é isso que o Tomás está dizendo naquele
this
momento. Eu
narrative
tenho
of
direito
roots
a um espaço
and
que eu
routes,
ocupo
that it
dentro
is
desse sistema,
a
dentro dessa
single way,
nação,
but
dentro
instead
desse
there is
limite
a parallel
geográfico que é
racialization between continental blacks and blacks in the diaspora.
A terra
I
é o
think
meu
more than
quilombo.
anything,
O meu espaço é o meu
we have to
quilombo.
engage with
Onde eu
the
estou,
multiplicity
eu
of the
estou.
plurality
Onde eu sou.
of black epistemologies, that there has been an understanding that deviates on either side of the Atlantic, but is sourced through Western imperialism. That this idea of indigenizing
que não acontece só para os negros.
Ghana or making
Acontece para a nação.
Africa an
Ele
Afrocentricity,
aparece, ele surge nos momentos de crise
basically
da
another
nacionalidade.
layer of biological essentialism, is
A nós
to
não nos
separate and
cabe
really segregate
valorizar a história.
the
A
black
nós nos cabe
experience, and instead of
ver
networking them together in a more
o contínuo
rhizomatic
nessa história.
effort where it's decentralized, that
Que
what
Zumbi
is
queria fazer a
happening
nação
not just
brasileira.
in the Caribbean
Já com
or not
índios e
just
negros
in the
integrados,
American
né?
South, but
Ele quer empreender
everywhere.
projeto
Is that
nacional
everyone
de uma
has
forma
a
traumática, mas não tão
right
traumática
and
quanto os
equal
ocidentais
value
fizeram.
of what they have
Destruindo.
experienced, and to learn from each other
Destruindo
produces
a história
this sentiment
dos
of
povos dominados.
transnational blackness, that race might be a global idea, but is a local sentiment, and just because there is no monolithic understanding of global blackness, that's okay, that we don't need to historicize, do the museum treatment to Africa because it refuses newness, and not newness in time, but newness in place, really nowness. And I think this was predominantly a intellectual project from the academy and anthropologists specifically. That there is capital investment in producing borders of ideology and refusing intermeshing. And you can see this through the Black is Beautiful campaign, where a lot of American Black thought that was coming up during the 60s was, well, the main idea was something that the sort of main idea was a vindicationalist one, that we are striving to have a voice in this place alongside, potentially even above, white supremacist ideas and notions that have completely saturated the landscape. Whereas what was going on in Africa was much more of a question of interiority and personal reflection of how do we regain ourselves on our own. And it was the Black radical tradition collects pieces through the lens of anti-imperialism. That anti-imperialism is not a project to stay within a single nation or a certain side of an ocean, but there is a nuance to not just race but imperialism and how it acts and what it strives to do. And this is something that, again, to go back to Black radical politics in the 60s, shout out to them, that Huey Newton deals with briefly with intercommunalism, that there is a radical politic of Black internationalism instead of this idea of race relations, or to focus purely on the cultural expressions or African retentions, that it exceeds that. And so in understanding that, you can start to see how neocolonialism specifically resides within Africa, and how it is, very different, and it produces a network of understandings that is similar to what we're dealing with, but is also different in its hegemonic thought. And I'm saying how hegemony functions in the West, whereas how it functioned in Africa. And if we don't check that, then there's a sort of exoticism that we can have because we might believe that Africa doesn't have to engage with these problems anymore, that they are left to their own devices. And, as I even say this, it sounds silly, but I think from what we learn now in 2023, it's hard to acknowledge the blind spots or the epistemological or ways of seeing that there were blind spots in the 60s and the 70s, that how Black identity formed was, quite nationalist. And even with the connections that were desired between Africa and the West, really ran through exotic ways. And once again, before it was even possible to make those trips, there was the white academics like Melville Herskovits again, and Fraser or Drake, which all three of them come up in chapter 7, that not just essentialize but objectivize. They fetishize Black thought and its relation to space, which is anthropology, this institutional study of hierarchical, biological, human variation, trying to see these differences and how West Africa communicates culturally with the Caribbean, and then how the Caribbean connects to the Americas. They begin to use culture as a shorthand for race, and when you do that, you can produce these kind of isolationist tendencies, that there's American culture or American Blackness and Caribbean culture, Caribbean Blackness. And it wasn't up until the introduction of diasporic studies they began to break down this false idea of this sort of one-way mirror of culture transmission, or the idea that the diaspora, regardless of where you end up, on whatever shore you end up, you begin with no culture whatsoever.
Essa palavra tem uma história. Também tem uma tipologia de acordo com a região e de acordo com a ordem.
What I should have started this with are the questions that Pierre begins with, or has questions in this chapter. And they predominantly deal with the overdeterminism of authenticity in Africa. And so I guess I wanted to open up to the questions of Afrocentricity and how far that can lead to helping out or benefiting the colonial project of leaving Africa where it is in time and space, which is sort of at the, their understanding, again, hegemonic, linear, vertical understandings, at the bottom of development or modernity. And at the same time, because it's at the bottom, is what is the main area of extraction. And so through all this extraction, they feed back into this place in society, these thoughts of purity and false linearity and authenticity. So considering the people who are listening to this are predominantly Westerners, I wanted to introduce and leave you with not just a couple of quotes from this movie called Ori, which came out, predominantly deals with Afro-Brazilian Black consciousness, but they're also trying to produce these connections between Africa, and not in a way that overdetermines or gives the utmost authority to Africa simply because it is Africa, that there is a mutual sharing and a mutual project to contend with that has common goals, but different contexts. And so Paul Gilroy, the Black Atlantic, he talks about overlapping. And I love that the Black Atlantic, and everyone says this all the time, but the Black Atlantic decenters continent and focuses on the areas of transmission and what it could mean to think about how transmission is a fluid thing. And so he uses this term overlapping, and I think of it metaphorically, but also I imagine water and waves overlapping from coast to coast. And although those waves might look like it is doing this back and forth thing, it's almost like an estuary. It's doing this sort of mixing, and that might be important, but it also might not be. You might not see it as that, so that's okay. Tell me what you think. Thank you for listening, and I'm going to leave you with a couple of exciting excerpts from a movie that I really, really enjoy. Thank you for listening.
A memória são conteúdos de um continente, da sua vida, da sua história, do seu passado. Como se o corpo fosse o documento. Não é à toa que a dança para o negro é um momento de libertação. O homem negro não pode estar liberto enquanto ele não esquecer o cativeiro, não esquecer no gesto que ele não é mais um cativo. A linguagem do transe é a linguagem da memória. Tudo isso não resgata a dor a um corpo histórico. Aquela matéria se distende, mas ao mesmo tempo ela traz com muito mais intensidade a história, a memória, o desejo. O desejo de não ter vivido a experiência do cativeiro. A escravidão é uma coisa que está presente no corpo, no nosso sangue, na nossa veia. O seu comportamento físico, psicológico, diante do real. Né? Então ele chega devagar, ele chega se dando. Meu amigo, companheiro, vem chegando devagar.
...480 anos depois do início de sua formação, este país ainda não encontrou o caminho da sua verdadeira realização. O problema aqui não é um problema de regime, de sociedade. É muito mais grave. É um problema de civilização. É a civilização ocidental que faliu. Eu sou única pessoa da participação universalista que está nessa sala. Nós temos gente de São Paulo, temos gente de São Carlos, temos núcleo em São Carlos funcionando. Por que eu sou o único que estou aqui? Porque esse debate, minha gente, esse debate é uma mentira. Esse debate é uma farsa, sabe? Vocês que não estão informados, que estão aqui pensando que vai haver um debate de verdade, tem que saber que isso aqui é uma mentira. Agora, gente, é o seguinte, o nosso povo está morrendo de fome. O nosso povo não pode sair na rua, porque a polícia mata. E esses engraçadinhos, esses vigaristas, estão aí fazendo discussão sociológica, conversa fiada, trabalho político, querendo controlar o movimento para organização política, porque eles no futuro querem ser deputados à custa de vocês. Vocês querem ser servo e acomodado? Continue. Era isso que eu tinha a dizer para vocês. Para quem gostou, muito obrigado. Para quem não gostou, procure me entender.
Gente, hoje, quando nós falamos em zumbi, uma coisa nós devemos ter sempre claro: é unidade em torno do nosso movimento. Será lucrativo esses facciosismos, esses ataques diretos a esta ou aquela pessoa? Estaremos aqui.
Vamos garantir a palavra do companheiro que estava falando.
senhor. Se isso é lucrativo para nós, se nós não estamos fazendo aqui o jogo do colonizador, que nos domina, até onde?
A razão pela qual nós estamos aqui hoje traz muita dor. Essa dor de ser discriminado por um olhar. Enfim, todas essas dores, elas se transformam em ódio. Só que eu acredito que consciência é quando a gente assume o nosso conflito. E assumir o nosso conflito é assumir todas essas dores. E consciência negra é a gente nunca jogar esse ódio contra a gente mesmo, mas sim contra aqueles que nos exploram.
Eu acho que consciência negra, ela é a compreensão que nós temos da nossa realidade. Da nossa realidade enquanto povo, da nossa realidade dentro da sociedade como um todo. Nós temos divergências profundas no seio da comunidade. É por isso que as lutas internas dentro da comunidade vão começar a se desenvolver. Nós temos que parar de lutar a nível de pessoas e começar